Hi, welcome to the Newberry Chronicles. I'm Michael,
And I'm Rebecca.
and this is a podcast where we read through all the books that have won Newbery medals and then talk about it. And this time we are going to be talking about Lois Lenski's Strawberry Girl, which won the Newbery in 1946. That's what we're going to be. That's what we're going to be about. I'll give a brief overview of the author because I think her story it seems important to talking about this book. And she's also kind of interesting. We're actually running into a lot of interesting authors. I feel like through this podcast so far, and Lois Lenski is not an exception. Her name is Lois Lenore Lenski, and actually, though you were looking, it's actually Lois Lenore Lenski Covey. Is that right?
Yes. If she changed her name, she definitely married Arthur Covey.
Wikipedia has her husband's name as her last name, but also has all the other names in between. And her professional, published name is Lois Lenski. She was born in the late 1800s and was the daughter of a Lutheran pastor and a theologian who wrote some New Testament commentaries. And I include that because, as we'll talk about later, faith becomes an important part of this book. But she was born in Ohio to this Lutheran pastor, so you got that kind of classic Midwest upbringing, Lutherans, Ohio. She went to Ohio State and studied education and got a teaching certificate or license or whatever they called it back then. But she also studied art. And after she graduated, I guess she didn't want to teach. And so she went to art school for several years. And there she met the man who would become her husband, Arthur Covey, and she married him, and they moved to Connecticut.
So, quick aside.
Okay.
Michael, I had started to read the history of Lois Lenski a while before we did this podcast, and when we were getting ready to do the podcast, I was like, why can I not remember anything that I read about this woman? And I remembered when I was looking at Michael's notes that I got caught on her marrying Arthur Covey and then went on a rabbit trail to find out if she was the mother or the grandmother of Stephen Covey. And if anyone on this podcast knows who that is, he wrote this whole time management course of which the company that I used to work for based all of our planners off of. But in my bird trail, it did not seem that they were related. So that is just a quick aside for you.
As you can tell, in this household, we have fascinating interests. Just the most interesting little things that pique our curiosity. But anyway, Arthur Covey, not related.
Not Stephen Covey's dad
not
or
related
grandpa.
to the pioneer of time management. Anyway, this guy painted murals. Wikipedia says he's a muralist. I don't know if that's a profession, but he was artistic. And Lois Lenski was artistic as well, and her ambition was to be a painter. She eventually she eventually incorporated writing into her work, but her entry into children's literature was actually as an illustrator, and she did some pretty famous stuff. She did illustrations of an edition of Wind in the Willows. She also did the illustrations for the first edition of The Little Engine That Could. I have not looked at the first edition, so I don't know if those are the illustrations that I'm familiar with, but that's a pretty big deal. She also illustrated all of her own books, so Strawberry Girl, which we're going to be talking about here pretty soon. She did all the illustrations in that, and there are quite a few in the book. Writing was sort of a mid-career shift. She didn't write her first book until she was in her 30s, when someone else suggested that she write about stuff.
Well, and did you read about this? I remember briefly seeing it, but if I'm remembering correctly, Arthur was not very supportive of her writing ambitions in the beginning. I think he just wanted her to be a stay-at-home wife and not have any career ambitions. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is kind of funny. He married her under the expectations that she would be a homemaker, but she hated housework, and so she would hire help to do the housework so that she could do her own artistic pursuits. And I think that he eventually kind of came around
Yeah.
and was cool with it. Probably once she started winning Newbery medals. Um,
Hopefully before
Maybe
that.
before that, yeah, because she had been writing books for a long time by the time Strawberry Girl came around.
But there's a little bit of women empowerment for you.
Yeah, that's right. Lois Lensky, feminist icon. At any rate, so when she started writing books, most of her books fit into two categories, and these are like conscious categories that she cultivated. And if you look in the front of Strawberry Girl, and it'll tell you what else Lois Lensky wrote. They have them categorized under these like columns, and so she wrote historical novels and she wrote regional novels, and those were her titles for them. The historical novels were like that you would expect, where she would write about accounts from history and kind of dramatize them into novels. And then the regional novels, of which Strawberry Girl is one, were basically where she would kind of pick a regional culture that she had visited or was familiar with in some way, and write a novel that took place in that, and striving to be as accurate and observational of the culture as possible. And so Strawberry Girl is one of those. And this, like, just as an aside, I took a whole class on this in grad school. Like, this kind of fits into the broader trend of regional writing, which is something that kind of comes out of travel writing. It's kind of probably boring for people who didn't take this class, but with the rise of magazines and periodicals in the 19th century, there was a lot of interest in travel writing. So people would go to exotic locations and then write about their experiences there. And this eventually turns into what was called like the local color or regional movement, where rather than going to whatever India or Jamaica or something, a lot of travel writing is we're a European or a white dude going to an exotic place where there's people who aren't white, and I'm going to kind of write about them in maybe kind of condescending ways, but also trying to understand them. Regional writing was within the United States, so someone would travel to a different part of the United States and then write about that, so that someone in New York would know what it would be like living in, whatever, Alaska. So this Strawberry Girl is one of those. When she was in, I don't know. I can't remember how old she was, but like kind of middle of her life, she started having health problems, and this is all from Wikipedia, and Wikipedia doesn't say what health problems there were, but the doctor recommended that she get away from the Connecticut winters, and so during the winter, she and her husband would travel and visit places with more temperate climates, and one of the places that she travels is to Florida, and Lakeshore. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the specific town that she went to in Florida. But anyway, that one of those winter visits is where she got the kind of idea for Strawberry Girl. And she says a lot of the incidents in Strawberry Girl are based on actual accounts that people have told her when she went there. So just a little bit more about her, because I think this is funny, before we actually get into the book. In her time, like when she was publishing these regional novels, a lot of people considered them to be too dark and grim for children, because children's literature, was it's supposed to be wholesome, it's supposed to be lighthearted, and she was here portraying like people who were poor or people who were marginalized in some way. And so there's of course some like grittiness and darkness associated with that. And so people at the time were like, "Well, that's pretty edgy for kids literature." And she was very much of the opinion that children's literature isn't just for like kind of diverting bedtime stories, but they should like raise social awareness. And she was kind of like an anti-censorship person and all that sort of stuff. And that's cool. On the flip side, though, ironically, more modern evaluations of her work have kind of criticized her for the opposite thing. When modern scholars have looked at her stuff, a lot of times they've seen it as didactic and maybe overly sentimental at times, and maybe whitewashing some of the less savory elements, especially when it comes to like the relationships between like the kind of like, white settler colonial Americans and, um, you know, black people or Native
Hmm.
Americans or, what have you. And
And that's
so,
definitely in this book. Those concerns are in this book.
yeah, you have to kind of like sympathize with her. It's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation because
Right.
she was pushing the boundaries of children's literature in the 40s. But now, we might look at it, when children's literature is a much more wide open genre than it was at the time, and we kind of see it as shortcomings in terms of like depicting the time period. So
Right.
anyway, I think I wanted to give all that introduction because I felt like that because this book we keep talking about nonfiction books, and this is not a nonfiction book, but it edges right up to nonfiction, and because of that, I think it's important to kind of understand like a lot of the background for it. Rebecca, why don't you tell us what this book's actually about?
Yeah. So, Strawberry Girl tells the story. It takes place in the early 1900s, after the Seminole War. In
Which sorry, were you going to
No,
talk about
go
what this
ahead.
one? For the record, like there was a series of Seminole Wars. Again, I had to look this up. I don't know this off the top of my head, but there was a series of wars against the Seminole Indians, and it's a little more complicated than this, but like it basically shakes out to this is how white settlers gained control of land in Florida that was previously, occupied by the Seminoles, right? And that's alluded to a few different times in this book.
Yeah. And so this book, Strawberry Girl, describes crackers, which are descendants of Anglo-Saxon pioneer settlers in early Florida. And just as a quick aside, as I was reading that, I don't know if you had the same question in your head, but all I was thinking when I kept reading about crackers was, is this where it came from to call white people crackers?
Yeah, I have no idea because in this book it's like a term of endearment. It's like
Yes.
self-identified.
Yeah.
It's not derogatory. I don't know.
Anyway, I just found that funny. But this book features two main families, the Boyers and the Slaters, and they are relatively neighbors in what you would have. Like, obviously, they both have a lot of land. They don't live
Right.
next
It's
door
very
to each
rural.
other, but probably their closest neighbors were each other. The Slaters have been really established in this community. They're very proud that their grandfather was an Indian fighter and he won this land, and so it's theirs. The
Big
Boyers,
yikes.
yes, big yikes. The Boyers are migrant farmers. They've come from North Carolina and they're now in Florida and they plant strawberries. Um, so the conflict really emerges between these two families, and a lot of the questions that come up are questions of land ownership, like fencing is a big deal.
Not
Whether
like sword fighting,
Sorry,
but
no, like fencing their land so that the animals can't have open range, which creates problems for the Slater's animals not being able to reach water. So, really, a lot of the story centers around these two families and their conflict. The main characters are Bertie Boyer, who is Strawberry Girl, and then a lot of the book centers around her relationship with the neighbor boy Jefferson Davis Shoestring Slater. So you're not ever quite clear if these two are friends, but their stories are often juxtaposed against one another. Um, in my opinion, Bertie's dad is kind of painted as this fairly honorable man, and Shoestring's dad is an alcoholic who can't provide for his family. And so the book ends with a successful crop for the Boyers, and the Slater father converts and goes to work for the phosphate company that's leasing the land that his cattle run over to get water. So he ends up going to work for that corporation that's ruining his way of life. And the Slaters also decide that they're going to plant strawberries after seeing the Boyer's success. So some things that I left out is um, a lot of this book is very process oriented over the planting of the crops and the harvesting of the sugar cane and just the different practices that those people would have had. And it also focuses a lot on the struggle to do those things, but that's kind of the overview. Anything I left out that you think is important?
I no, I don't think so. There's a few
There's
other. It's not just these two families. There's like other
no,
characters, but that is, and like they go to church, and there's
right.
like they go to school at one point, although
And
not very
that's a
often.
that's a kind of a subplot that becomes important in the end is the role of education and Bertie's desire to get educated and Shoestring and his brothers kind of like indifference about it. And so that there's not a lot about that, but I do think Linsky tries to tie that in all together at the end in a way that's supposed to be this really significant part of the book, but it didn't quite land for me. So I'll get into what I liked before
what did you like for?
I really liked the setting of this book, and I liked the dialect. I also liked that everybody has a dialect, and it's not like there's, you know, I don't know, because sometimes in these books, they only portray the dialect of the people that are kind of being like
these are the poor folks, so they have the dialect.
I think she's pretty consistent throughout the book about that, so I really liked that. I don't really know very much about early Florida. The only other book I can think of that I would have read around, like, even just kind of around the same area or time period would have been Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is obviously a very different book.
Also
about a very different group of people.
Very heavily relying on dialect.
Yes.
Zora Neale Hurston was a student of, like, she studied a lot of that.
Which that is a great book and a better book. But I also enjoyed what little character development that we got. I really liked the relationship between Bertie and Shoestring. That was kind of like my favorite part of the book, is just kind of watching them navigate life together. But that's what I liked. What did you like?
I liked a lot of that same stuff. I like that. I mean, this is kind of like her goal is you observe these people and try to depict them as they are, warts and all. And I think the book is structured in such a way that there are moral judgments, but there kind of aren't in the same way that you would have them in other books. A lot of the book is kind of just saying what happens, right? And we see how the characters react to those things. And we see how, like, specifically Bertie, whose perspective we're in most of the time, we see how she reacts. But I think the book has some interesting tensions in them because the narrator doesn't ever editorialize in the same way that, like, other children's lit editorialize. Like, I'm thinking about, like, some of the other early books we've read, like, and I realize these are nonfiction, so it's a little bit different, but, like, The Story of Mankind or Invincible Louisa, like, both of those have narrators that present a very clear moral point of view, not just because of the structure and what happens, but because they tell you what to think. And I think this book does less of that. And there's some interesting stuff. And again, we can, maybe in some of the stuff we didn't like, we can get into, like, how I feel like there are some shortcomings with this approach. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting, like, in the fight against, like, between these two families, you kind of have escalating stuff that happens. Like, first, the Slaters' cows, like, run over the strawberries. And then the dad, Bertie's dad, does something back to them. And it kind of escalates. And, like, you get to a point where people are, like, the characters have, like, different opinions about what is being done. And sometimes it's surprising. Like, sometimes the dads will seem friends, and then they'll do something that's kind of, you know, strongly aggressive toward the other person. And you'll see different people react in different ways. And I don't know, I think that that's interesting. And if you're going to depict a community that has these sort of tensions, it's nice to see those tensions actually brought out in ways that feel fairly complex at times. I like the attention to detail, although, as we'll get into with the stuff we don't like, this is not my favorite type of book. You know, it reminds me a lot of the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, which have good things about them, but, you know, one of their flaws in my mind, or one of the things I don't like, is how they just step by step walk you through all those things. But at that same time, like, there's a, like, really terrific sense of place, and there's a really terrific sense of, like, this is what the experience of doing these things was like. You know, there are some passages that are really nice, that are really just kind of tactile and descriptive of, like, okay, here's what it was like to weed the strawberry patches, or here's what it was like to go to the general store and, like, have, like, different interactions with people. Like, I don't know, like, this is something that I think a lot of regional literature does, or local color literature does, which is that because it's so observational, you get almost this documentary type approach where they're just including details because they want to paint this picture of the environment. And I think there's some nice stuff there. So yeah, I think, before we shift to be negative, there are things that I like about this. I'm now thinking about like the structure that we always have is like the introduction, then what we liked and what we didn't like, and that maybe makes the podcast end on downer notes because we end on what we don't like. But I will say I didn't dislike this book. Like for the things that we were going to say that are negative, I think that there are good things about this book, and there are things that are special about this book. And I don't think I've read any other Lois Linsky books. I don't remember, but maybe special about just her work in general, like this attention to small communities. I was looking, and it's not just like small Southern communities. Like she does like New England communities, like in Vermont and stuff like that. And I think there's a skill in kind of capturing the sensory details that make a community what it is. That is not to be taken for granted, and she does a good job, I think, of that.
Yeah, I think she is talented, and I like that she took these stories from real life as much as she could. Like she interviewed people that lived there, and put their stories into this book, and so I think that is all very neat. You kind of touched on this, Mike. Oh, go ahead.
So now let's.
Okay.
This is the time to bring out our knives.
Not our knives, but kind of a segue. You mentioned this, Michael, but this book is not very plot oriented, which are the books that I enjoy. And at some points, it felt anticlimactic to me because what it will do is tell you. Also, just the way that she builds like hope, I'm expecting something to happen after it because just the natural progression of like books that I've read is everybody's really looking forward to this thing happening, and then the conflict is going to be that it doesn't happen, but in the end it works out okay. And this book sort of does that, but it's more like here's this struggle that we've had after we were really excited, and then the next day everything's okay, and they have a big harvest, and there's no explanation of how they got that harvest if the cows destroyed the plants, or they think, oh, and the other thing is the Slaters are always telling them that I forgot to mention this in the summary, the Slaters are always telling the Boyers that they're not going to be successful because the Florida climate is so hard and there's no way they're going to raise strawberries or whatever. They're like, no, we did it in North Carolina, we're going to do it here. And so you start, when they have all these struggles, you think that the Slaters are going to be proven right, and they're proven wrong, but there's no explanation of why.
Yeah, that's true. There are multiple times, like not just once, but like multiple times where the book describes something that destroys their strawberry crop. And I'm probably stating it too strongly to say destroyed because they eventually do harvest strawberries,
and super successful.
Yeah, and maybe this is just like in the moment it seems that way, but they'll be like I mentioned earlier, the instance in which the Slaters' cows come and trample all the plants, and they're like, oh no, our crop. And then the next chapter, they're still growing the strawberries, and it's not clear. Yeah, sorry, I'm interrupting.
No, I'm glad that I'm not the only one because I kind of was reading it like, am I missing something? I felt like, so it felt kind of anticlimactic to me, but it's also written, while it is a book with like a theme going through it, it's also very episodic, which in general, like, is not a fault of the book. That's just not my favorite kind of book. This is kind of petty, but a lot of the illustrations come before the part that she's illustrating. So you'll see an illustration of something that you haven't read yet. It kind of like gives it away what you're about to read. And maybe that's just the publisher and how they put the book together. But I felt like I should either be seeing this on the same page that I'm reading it or seeing it on the next page. I don't know.
I would be interested, since she both writes and illustrates that, I would be interested in like her input on the format because not a lot of authors do that.
Right. So that is probably, might not even been anything that Lois did, but I thought it was strange. And we've kind of touched on this a bit. It's unclear what the narrator actually endorses and what they don't of how these people are living, but I feel like the book is clearly on the side of the Boyers.
Oh, I think so.
And there are just some things that are very hypocritical about them that I don't feel like is ever fully addressed. And that bothered me. Like the dad will say he goes and beats this kid over something I think is stupid, but he beats him and the family's like, no, don't beat him, whatever. And he's like, well, you should learn to love your neighbor. And I just was like, okay, that's problematic. Another thing is that same dad is really the reason why he beats this kid is he doesn't think he's taking care of this cow. And Birdie's like, and I get it, my dad just really loves animals and he really wants them to be taken care of. And then when he gets mad at his neighbor, he kills 3 of his hogs. So it's just things like that the wives do have this moment. The mothers do have this moment at the end where they're like, yeah, both our husbands, they've been kind of ridiculous and I'm glad we can all be friends now. So it's not like he doesn't get off scot-free, but there's just some problems in the characters that I think that it's very clear the whole time that the Slater dad is problematic because he's an alcoholic and can't provide for his family. And the Boyer dad just makes mistakes sometimes.
Right. And he's also the other dad, the Slater dad, is also closed-minded, right? Because he doesn't care about his kids getting educated. He doesn't want, like, he's always criticizing these new ways of doing things.
Right.
Like he's like a regressive character in that sense, where the Boyers are bringing something new, and the dad is just like, you guys are real dumb. Like this isn't gonna work. And then he's always proven wrong. And so that's what I meant this earlier with the structure is that even though a lot of it is observational and without judgment, the way that the plot rolls out proves the Boyers right time and time again, and the Slaters are almost never right.
Yes, I agree. And there's things about their character that I think that the author is trying to highlight as like positive things that I think are really negative things. But again, it was a different era. You know, there was a different belief about parenting and when you parent other children and what that looked like. So I have to take that into account too. But I just didn't really like that dad, I think is what I'm trying to say. The other thing, and we've mentioned this too, but this book is clearly on the side of the colonizers. And that is just, again, part of its era, but it is problematic. So what did you not like?
Well, I mean, you kind of hit on some of that. I didn't really love, again, like part of the appeal of a book like this for me is the way that you have this kind of non-judgmental thing. And so having the dad do stuff that's like blatantly hypocritical, or just stuff that would have just reflected the behavior at the time and without really like, issuing a reprimand, from the authorial voice. Like, I think that that's like a positive thing about the book, but it's inconsistently applied because the story itself kind of works to validate a certain point of view that I don't know. All right, so I'm gonna get into a main thing that I didn't like, because most of the book I was kind of reading along and I was interested in. I like that there's like tension and I don't really know like who I'm supposed to side with or whatever. But I want to talk about the end of the book because that's like my biggest issue with the end of the book.
Let loose.
And so let me describe first how the book ends. So spoilers, if you've not read Strawberry Girl, and another spoiler.
I hit on this briefly.
You did in your plot synopsis, but I'm going to get more specific.
Okay.
So we have Mr. Slater the whole time is like this bad dude, right? And I am saying that he is a bad dude. I also think most of the characters think he's a bad dude because he's an alcoholic, will abandon his family and go and drink in the bar and use all their money, and so they're poor. Like, there's a scene that's really sad where he has just gotten paid for something, I don't remember what, and so the family has gone into town. He sold a cow. The family goes into town, they're going to buy all these things, like new clothes and stuff like that they need. And so they get all the stuff, and the store owner is like, here, I'll hold this, and you go get the money. And they go and try to get the money, and turns out he's like drunk and used the money and gambled it away, or something of that nature. And so like he does things that are, I think at the time and now we would consider like that's not great.
Right.
He's not a great dude. And so none of what I'm about to say is an endorsement of that sort of behavior. But I don't really like the way it plays out, because he's like that until the very last chapter, or second to last chapter, the end of the book, where, as Rebecca mentioned earlier, he gets converted and
To Christianity.
to Christianity, of course.
I
like
didn't say that.
this is
So-
a mainstream novel from the 1940s in
but
America.
people probably like converted to what?
He converts to Buddhism. No, he converts to Christianity, and it's through a weird circumstance, honestly, where he the past, like, this traveling preacher helps out his family, and it's nice. Like, that element's nice. What I don't like is he converts to Christianity and instantly all of their problems evaporate. He is no longer an alcoholic because, I don't know. Again, 1940s, people have different ideas about alcoholism. But if you are a regional writer whose job is to be accurate and observe problems, like, surely you've observed people with alcoholism and understand that it is more complicated than simply a moral failure. But that's kind of like what the book presents it as, because he instantly just gets better. At the end of the book, he becomes a much more a nicer, open-minded person. And again, like, of course, people can have conversion experiences that change them, but there's no build up to this at all. Like, he's just bad dude, bad dude, bad dude. He converts, and then he's nice, and all their problems are gone. And I just find this really unsatisfying. And I also, it just doesn't strike me as realistic. Like, if the book is supposed to be realistic, which is like a stated intent of the author, we should know that life is more complicated than that. And again, like, going back, like, I know she was criticized in her time for it being too dark. And so I understand that, like, the conventions of the time would mean that you have an unambiguous happy ending and blah, blah, blah. Like, so all of this is definitely, like, me in 2022 complaining about it, but that's all I got, right? I'm living in the year 2022. That's my perspective. But also, living in the year 2022, I'm gonna bring out from the closet my socialist hat and put it on, and play socialist, which, for the record, in the 1940s was not quite so marginalized as in 2022. So in a sense, I am embodying the spirit of the time period. FDR's president. We got the New Deal. We got labor organizing. Unions have made, great strides, etc. So here I am, 1940s man.
And if you hear that little tap,
I'm
that's Michael smacking his hands together.
I'm smacking my fist. This is the sound of the dictatorship of the proletariat seizing the means of production. But anyway, so as Rebecca also mentioned, he converts to Christianity, and in so doing, he becomes, the book doesn't describe it this way, but it's very clearly portrayed as, like, the book doesn't use these exact words, but he's portrayed as becoming a functional member of society, right? Mm-hmm. He's no longer an alcoholic, no longer wasting his time. He suddenly values, like, his kids are going to school now and all this sort of stuff. And I'm a school teacher. Send your kids to school. However, a big component of his conversion and becoming a functional member of society is that he begins to work for this company that is extracting phosphates, which I think they use for fertilizer. I'm not sure. Yeah. So anyway, this involves, like, basically, like, excavating land and stuff, like destroying the natural environment.
Well, and the reason why he has to work for them is he can't have an open range for his cattle anymore because they've taken over the land that they would use to get to water. So basically, they're eliminating whatever means of living he had.
Right. And so here's where this is my socialism talking. So a conflict, a tension throughout the book that I found really interesting is that when the Boyers move from North Carolina, they come and they have bought the land. They are landowners. Mm-hmm. And they are acting like landowners, right? They want to fence in their property so that they can't be used by their neighbors. And, they have a very proprietary sense of the land. Whereas the Slaters say, hey, this has been common land for generations. And I mean, ironically, they say this is like, since we took it from the Seminole, right? Like, they say multiple times, my granddaddy was a Seminole or an Indian fighter. So, whatever, asterisks, like, they stole this from the Seminoles, so maybe this is karmic. But they have been living with common land where everybody in the community uses this land to feed their cows, irrigate stuff like, and then here we have people who start buying up land and kind of closing off people's resources. So a big tension between the Slaters is the Slaters think, hey, this is land that everyone should be able to use. Whereas the Boyers say, we bought this land, we were trying to grow crops on it, and by it being common land, we can't, profit off it to the extent that we would like. And the book is, I think, really interesting in exploring this tension until the end, in which, like I said, the structure of the book makes it such that, like, kind of the interesting observational stuff, you kind of run into this moral wall. And, he's a productive member of society, and he allows this common land to be taken over by this company that's going to be extracting stuff from the land. And, like, I mean, if we fast forward, decades, we can, see the issues of this that would come up in the, 70s or whatever, where you have like rampant pollution as a result of industrialization and that sort of stuff. But obviously, like in the 1940s and certainly in the beginning of the 20th century, people wouldn't have realized this. But anyway, he allows a corporation to come and buy land and work for them. And I just think this sucks as a resolution for this tension because it, and again, this is my perspective, it means that the moral viewpoint of the novel becomes an arc of people who have valued the common good, ceding it to private interests, and that being a good thing. And I know it's complicated. This dude was not a good dude, and blah 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 blah. But the way that it equates being a morally good person and being a productive member of society with becoming like a laborer for a corporation and allowing land to be fenced off so that only private interests can benefit from it. I don't know. That's a bummer. And I mean, again, I'm wearing the socialist hat. I've grown a big old beard and I look like Karl Marx now in the moment. Karl Marx, when people quote about like, religion being the opiate of the masses or whatever, this is one of the things he's talking about is religion is used to justify a certain status quo for powerful people, and the promise of moral cleanliness and the promise of like an afterlife where the material conditions of the present world are irrelevant, allow for people to become complacent and complicit with capitalism, private interest, blah blah blah. And that's exactly what happens at the end of this book. And I think Karl Marx would probably be like, wow, what a depressing ending. But Lois Linsky, at least as the book is structured, makes this like, yay, isn't it nice that this mean old dude is now working from a corporation. There's no longer this common land. This guy no longer even like works for himself. He is, working for this corporation, and that's supposed to be a good thing, I think. And again, like the book is kind of hands off. Like the book is pretty observational, but I think it's pretty clear by the ending. Like this is a happy ending, and I don't know. Again, my perspective in 2022, bringing out my dusty labor movement socialist hat from the 1940s, says this is not really a happy ending, and I don't like that it's presented as such. So there's my rant. That was a nearly 10-minute rant. Saying all of
that, do you give this book a thumbs up?
Yes. I'm a class traitor now. I've betrayed. So I'm taking off my socialist hat and just putting on my writer hat. And I think it's well written, well observed.
Yeah, I agree. I think that her strengths outweigh her faults in this book. And while it's not my favorite kind of book, I did enjoy reading it. So I give it a thumbs up. Not 2, but 1.
My thumb is weakly up, right? Like if a strong breeze blows, my thumb might fall over. But it is mostly it's up.
Yeah,
it's pointing.
Especially, and we have to take into account, which I think we've said that throughout this podcast, but we do have to take into account the era within which these books were written. What was the thinking of the time? What did people know at the time, and what do we know now? So, I would give it a thumbs up.
So I will say though, like again, thumbs up. And the asterisk that I would like us to put with the thinking of the time is we have to consider the author.
Right.
And because as I mentioned a second ago, when I was like, pulling out my Marx and Engels rant, but there was, a very vibrant sense of like the common good and common interest in the United States. Like the 1940s, were perhaps the height of that certain kind of like collectivism in the United States. And I mean, you even have like stuff like, and I know Woody Guthrie's a little bit later, I believe, but like this land is your land, this land is my land, right? Like that is like a song that like it has a verse against like private ownership of land. And so like in the time period, there were perspectives that were different than this. But Lois Lenski is someone who is, not from this area and coming and observing. And I think that makes her position differently than, say, if someone who is in the Slater's position had written this book. So I think that also, in addition to saying, well, there were some viewpoints that are of the time, we also have to consider she's not really native to this land. And so she may not she may have kind of missed some of the, like how the natives would have completely felt. If you are a person of means coming into a land that largely is like poverty, perhaps you might have missed some of the class tensions.
Very good point.
So that's that, but it's good.
Yeah.
Our next book, next time, we're going to be in the 1950s. Do you remember what book? Not book. Do you remember what year?
It says 1959.
1959.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. So Rebecca, do you want to briefly mention the?
Yeah. Our next book that we're going to be talking about is The Witch of Blackbird Pond by Elizabeth George Spear. So join in next time.
Yeah. I've read this book before. I don't think Rebecca has.
I have not, but I have heard much about it, so I'm glad to finally be reading it. It is late in the game for me to be reading it, but still. I'm excited.
A classic of assigned reading in elementary school.
Yes, it's true. It's true. But I went to a conservative Christian school, so you probably couldn't have read a book with the word witch in it. So
maybe. There's a lot of conservative Christians in The Witch of Blackbird Pond.
Yeah, I don't know. So, thanks for listening.
Bye.